Hey everyone, tonight we're going to travel back in time. Not to a grand battlefield or a glittering royal court, but to a dusty, quiet room, lit by the soft glow of an oil lamp. You're in late 19th century Beijing, and the air is thick with the scent of dried herbs, old ink, and a sickness you can't quite shake. The ailment is malaria, and the cure involves, among other things, ground-up fossils. Let's be honest, faced with the medical realities of 1899, you probably wouldn't survive this, especially if you were squeamish about your prescriptions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from, so please post your city or country and your local time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see this little corner of the internet span the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fever has you in its grip. One moment you're shivering, wrapped in every blanket you own, and the next you're kicking them away, sweat beading on your brow. You are Wang Yirong, a man of considerable standing. You're the Chancellor of the Imperial Academy, a respected scholar of ancient bronzes and stone inscriptions, a man whose life is steeped in the tangible echoes of China's deep past. But right now you are simply a man laid low by a relentless illness. Your family, desperate to see you well, has sent a servant to the local apothecary for a traditional remedy. The prescription is a familiar one, a complex cocktail of herbs and minerals, its recipe refined over centuries. The servant returns with a bundle of paper packages, each containing a different, carefully weighed ingredient. It's your job to inspect them before they're boiled into a bitter, murky tea. You've done this before. You know what to look for: the quality of the ginseng root, the color of the dried chrysanthemum. But one ingredient gives you pause. It's labeled longu, or dragon bones. You know what these are, of course. For thousands of years, they've been a staple in the traditional pharmacopoeia. They are ancient, fossilized bones, dug up from the earth and believed to possess potent healing properties. They are ground into a fine powder and used to treat everything from anxiety to dysentery. They're usually just chalky, anonymous fragments of creatures long dead. But as you sift through the pieces in your hand, your scholar's eye, trained to see patterns where others see only chaos, snags on something unusual. There, on the smooth, yellowed surface of a flat piece of bone, are scratches. They are not random. They are not the marks of a farmer's plow or the gnawing of some ancient rodent. They are deliberate, elegant, and strangely familiar. They look like writing. You pick up another piece, and another. More characters. They are archaic, far older than the seal script on the Shang Dynasty bronzes you so admire. This script is simpler, more pictographic, yet it possesses a clear internal logic. It's a fully formed system of writing that no one has seen for 3,000 years. The fever seems to melt away, replaced by a different kind of heat. The thrill of discovery. This is the kind of adrenaline rush most academics only get when they find an extra donut in the break room. These aren't dragon bones. You realize with a jolt that they are likely turtle shells, specifically the plastron, the flat underbelly, and the shoulder blades of oxen, and someone, long, long ago, carved questions and perhaps answers into them. What you hold in your hands is not medicine, it is history, a lost archive mistaken for a folk remedy. For centuries, maybe millennia, people have been crunching, grinding, and boiling away the earliest known records of Chinese civilization. It's a thought that is both horrifying and darkly hilarious. Imagine gulping down a tea made from the Magna Carta to cure your indigestion. Historians still argue whether Wang Yirong himself was the first to notice the script, or if a knowledgeable antiques dealer, sensing an opportunity, subtly pointed it out to him to drive up the price. We may never know for sure, but the story of the sick scholar is the one that has endured. You instruct your servant to go back to the apothecary, not for more medicine, but for information. You tell him to buy every single piece of dragon bone they have in stock at any price, and to ask where they came from. The shopkeeper is cagey, of course. Provincial farmers bring them in, he says, from somewhere up north in Henan province. They're protective of their source. It's a small but steady income for them. You don't press the point through the servant. You know this will require a more delicate touch. For now, you sit in your study, the oil lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The offending brew of medicine sits forgotten, its steam curling into the air. Before you, spread out on your dark wood desk, are the fragments of a lost world. The characters seem to almost shimmer in the low light. They are questions posed to gods and ancestors by kings who lived and died more than 1,000 years before Confucius was even born. Turns out, dragons had surprisingly neat handwriting, and you, Wang Yirong, are the first person in 30 centuries to read it. The weight of that realization settles upon you, heavier and more profound than any fever. Your personal illness has accidentally diagnosed a historical amnesia spanning 3 millennia. The cure, you suspect, will be a long and arduous quest. The initial thrill of discovery solidifies into a quiet, burning obsession. Your study, once a place of broad intellectual curiosity, now has a singular focus. Maps are spread across the floor, and every flat surface is covered with bone fragments, which you are now acquiring with an almost feverish urgency. You become a known figure in the antiquities markets of Beijing, a scholar with an insatiable appetite for dragon bones. You dispatch agents to every apothecary and curio shop with simple instructions: buy everything and pay well. The word spreads quickly through the hushed, networked world of dealers. Soon, they are coming to you. They arrive at your door like shadows carrying cloth-wrapped bundles, their eyes glinting with a mixture of deference and cunning. They know you are a man of importance, and they know you will pay a premium for these specific, inscribed bones. The problem is, none of them will tell you the truth about where they come from. They guard the source of their wares like a dragon hoarding its gold, or perhaps more accurately, like a teenager hiding their browser history. They offer vague, conflicting stories. They are dredged from the rivers in Shandong, one might say, stroking his long, thin beard. Another will insist they are found only in the mountains of Shaanxi after a landslide. It's a deliberate campaign of misinformation designed to protect their golden goose. If a man like you, with your resources and connections, found the source, you would cut them out of the transaction entirely. You understand the game, so you play along, nodding sagely, paying their exorbitant prices, and all the while, you are collating the lies, searching for the single, consistent thread. You bring in a trusted friend and fellow scholar, a man named Liu Yi, to help with the growing collection. Together, you spend countless hours trying to piece fragments together, categorizing the script and marveling at the sheer scope of this lost archive. Your collection grows from dozens of pieces to hundreds, then thousands. You learn to distinguish the creamy, almost translucent texture of a turtle plastron from the heavier, more porous feel of an ox scapula. You begin to recognize recurring names, perhaps of the kings who were asking the questions or the diviners who were interpreting the answers. It feels less like scholarly research and more like detective work. If Sherlock Holmes's primary clue was a 3,000-year-old grocery list asking if the gods approved of a particular military venture. You learn through bitter experience that some of the bones being offered to you are fakes, hastily carved by opportunistic artisans trying to cash in on this new trend among wealthy collectors. But the real pieces are unmistakable. They possess an authority, an aura of immense age that no forger can replicate. One of your agents brings you a particularly grim bit of news. He's spoken with a farmer-turned-dealer who confessed that for years the men digging up these bones in his village often polished them smooth. They found that the apothecaries paid a slightly better price for unblemished dragon bones. The carvings, the priceless historical records, were seen as imperfections to be buffed out before going to market. You close your eyes for a moment, picturing a farmer by a riverbank, diligently sanding away a king's plea to the heavens about an impending famine. The sheer tragic ignorance of it is a physical blow. How many thousands of these records have been lost forever, not just to the grinding pestle of the pharmacist, but to the simple desire to make a slightly better-looking product? Historians still argue whether the initial slowness in locating the source was due to the dealer's deliberate obfuscation or the scholar's own lack of field investigation skills. In this era, scholars are gentlemen of the study, not adventurers of the field. The idea of traveling to a dusty provincial village to dig in the dirt is almost alien. You rely on agents and intermediaries, navigating the world from the comfort of your ink-stained desk. But the frustration is mounting. The clues are contradictory. The cost is staggering, and the fear that the source may be plundered into oblivion before you can find it is a constant nagging worry. You begin to create a map, not of China, but of the lies you've been told. You mark the locations mentioned by the dealers, and slowly, a pattern begins to emerge from the noise. The stories that mention Shandong or Shanxi are always from less reliable sources. But the dealers who seem to have the oldest, most authentic pieces, the ones whose hands tremble slightly when they handle them, they all eventually, reluctantly, mention Henan province. And within Henan, one name starts to be whispered more than others: Anyang. Specifically, a small village just outside the city, a place called Xiaotun. The name is repeated enough times by different, unconnected dealers that you start to think it's either the source of the bones or the name of a very popular new tea house. You cross-reference the name with old provincial gazetteers and historical texts. There is nothing remarkable about Xiaotun. It's a poor farming community, situated on the floodplains of the Huan River. Yet the conviction grows within you. This unremarkable place is the key. The time for relying on second-hand information and cagey middlemen is over. You must go yourself. You must see this place, this Xiaotun, and stand on the earth that is giving up the ghosts of China's most ancient kings. The decision is made. You pack not just your clothes, but your rubbing paper, your brushes, and your scholarly intuition. The quest is leaving the quiet confines of your study and heading out into the muddy, unpredictable world. The journey south from Beijing is a slow, jolting affair that rattles your bones more effectively than any fever. You trade the paved streets of the capital for deeply rutted dirt tracks that turn to either dust clouds or muddy trenches with the slightest change in weather. The landscape unrolls before you, a vast flat expanse of brown earth and winter wheat under a pale, indifferent sky. After days of travel, you finally arrive in the vicinity of Anyang. There are no grand signs, no markers of historical importance. It is, by all appearances, a profoundly ordinary part of the Chinese countryside. The final leg of your journey takes you to the village of Xiaotun, and it's almost comically anticlimactic. You were expecting maybe a few crumbling columns, a majestic archway. Instead, you find a turnip field. It's the archaeological equivalent of a celebrity's shockingly normal high school yearbook photo. The village itself is a cluster of simple, rammed earth houses. Chickens scatter as you approach. Farmers, their faces weathered and creased like old leather, pause their work to stare at you. A stranger in a scholar's long gown, looking completely out of place. There is an air of quiet suspicion. These are the people who have been supplying the dealers in Beijing. They are wary, and your gentle questions about old bones are met with blank stares or outright denials. They know the value of their secret, and they are not about to share it with a city slicker who has appeared out of nowhere. You realize that a direct approach is useless. So you simply watch. You walk the fields, you follow the banks of the gently curving Huan River, and you pay attention to the earth itself, and that's when you see it. The ground here is not just soil, it's a dense matrix of history. With every step, your foot crunches on something ancient. You stoop down and pick up a shard of gray pottery, its rim decorated with a stamped pattern you recognize from the most primitive of bronzes. A few feet away, you spot a greenish, corroded piece of metal, likely a scrap from a bronze casting workshop. And then you see them. Lying half-exposed in a freshly plowed furrow is a fragment of a turtle shell, marred with the familiar, elegant script. The evidence isn't buried deep. It's right here on the surface, churned up by centuries of agriculture. You realize the entire village is basically a giant open-air museum, where the exhibits are periodically dug up to be sold as headache medicine. You learn through discreet observation that the epicenter of the digging is along the southern bank of the river. Farmers have been taking bones from these fields for generations. In fact, a local story tells of a particular family, the Quis, who made their fortune from a well on their property that never seemed to run dry of dragon bones. They had, by complete accident, sunk their well shaft directly into what was likely an ancient Shang Dynasty storage pit, a vertical treasure chest of royal records. You try to explain the significance of these finds to a local farmer, gesturing at the characters on a bone fragment. He just nods, more interested in the fact that your fancy city shoes are getting ruined by the mud. To him, you're not uncovering history. You're just a strange man with a deep interest in his compost heap. It is this very ordinariness that is so staggering. You are walking through the ruins of a great city, the capital of a dynasty that until now many scholars believed was purely mythical. The Shang Dynasty, described in the ancient texts of Sima Qian, was often treated like the Arthurian legends of Britain, a foundational myth, not a historical fact. But the bones in your study in Beijing, with their kingly names and detailed dates, suggested otherwise. And now this place, this Yinshu, the ruins of Yin, as the area was known in later historical periods, confirms it. This is the last capital of the Shang, a metropolis that thrived here from roughly 1300 to 1046 BCE. Your discovery is not just about finding the source of some curious artifacts. It is about pulling an entire dynasty from the realm of legend into the tangible light of history. As you stand on a small, raised plateau overlooking the river, the pieces of the puzzle click into place with dizzying speed. This wasn't just a village. The sheer density of artifacts, the vast spread of the ceramic sherds, the presence of what look like large rammed earth foundations just beneath the topsoil, it all points to a massive settlement. Historians still argue whether the Shang capital was a walled, concentrated city in the modern sense, or a more dispersed collection of ceremonial centers, workshops, and villages spread across the landscape. Looking out over the placid fields, it's hard to imagine bustling streets and towering temples, but you know they are here, sleeping just under the surface. This is it, Yin, the great capital, the source of the oracle bones, and you are standing in its graveyard, a graveyard that has been unknowingly looted for centuries. The feeling is a strange mix of soaring elation and profound urgency. You haven't just found the archive, you found the library, and it is sinking into the mud. The years that follow your initial solitary discovery are a whirlwind of frantic activity. The work of uncovering the past is no longer a secret, whispered about in the back alleys of Beijing's markets. It is now a proper scientific endeavor. You are part of a team of dedicated archaeologists and scholars backed by the national government. The haphazard plundering by local farmers is replaced by the meticulous grid of the modern excavation. Instead of crude shovels tearing through the earth, you now employ teams of trained workers who use delicate bamboo picks and soft brushes. This is the opposite of the farmer's smash-and-grab technique. Here, every speck of dust is treated with the reverence you'd normally reserve for a celebrity's autograph, and it's probably just as old. The work is slow, painstaking, and often frustrating. For every valuable find, there are days, even weeks, of digging through sterile soil, ancient refuse pits, and the collapsed foundations of common houses. The year is 1936. The air in Henan is dry and the political climate in China is tense. There is a palpable sense that your time here is running out, a feeling that a larger, more violent history is about to overtake your quiet quest for an older one. This urgency informs your work. You are digging against the clock. One morning, in an area of the site that has so far yielded very little, a workman's trowel makes a dull scraping sound. He calls you over. He hasn't hit rock or a pottery shard. It feels different, organic. As the team carefully brushes away the surrounding loess soil, the outline of a large rectangular pit begins to emerge. It's a common feature at Yinshu, usually a tomb or a storage cellar. But as you dig deeper, it becomes clear this is neither. There is no coffin, there are no bronze vessels, there are no human remains. Instead, there is a solid, dense mass of something else. At first, it's an indecipherable layer of pale, overlapping plates. Then, as a worker gently lifts one out of the matrix of soil, you see it. It is a nearly complete turtle plastron, the entire underbelly of the shell, and its surface is covered in a lattice of tiny, incised characters. And beneath it is another, and another, and another. A hush falls over the entire excavation site. The usual sounds of digging and chatter die away, replaced by the soft whisk of brushes and held breaths. You are not excavating a random assortment of discarded fragments. You have found an archive. This is the legendary Pit H3. It is a time capsule from the reign of King Wu Ding, one of the most powerful Shang rulers. The pit is packed, floor to ceiling, with inscribed turtle shells. They are stacked in layers, fitted together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. There are over 17,000 of them in this single hole in the ground. It is the mother lode. More oracle bones have been found in this one spot than in all the previous decades of collecting and digging combined. It's the ultimate proof that humanity has always had a hoarding problem. You can just picture the Shang King's spouse saying, "Wu Ding, you are not keeping all these old turtle shells. They're cluttering up the palace." As you stand on the edge of the pit looking down at this treasure trove, you notice the incredible state of preservation. These are not broken pieces. Many are whole, massive plastrons, some over a foot long. You see shells from species of turtle you know are not native to this arid northern plain. Some, with their distinctive shape, must have come from the subtropical marshlands of the Yangtze River Valley, hundreds of miles to the south, or perhaps even further. They were a form of tribute, a prized commodity sent to the capital for the exclusive use of the royal court. The biggest and best canvases were reserved for the king's most important questions. You watch as the team begins the Herculean task of lifting the shells out one by one. Each one is a document. Each one is a record of a conversation between a king and his gods. You are literally dismantling a library. Historians still argue whether Pit H3 represents a single, massive discarding of old records at the end of a king's reign, or a working archive that was carefully curated and stored over a longer period before being ritually buried. The careful stacking suggests a library, a deliberate act of organization, but the sheer volume feels like a final, ceremonial clearing of the desks. Whatever the reason, the result is a snapshot of the Shang world, unparalleled in its detail. You half expect to find a fossilized librarian with his finger held to his lips, shushing you from across 3 millennia for making too much noise. The pit is a silent testament to the bureaucracy of belief, a place where the spiritual and the administrative became one and the same, recorded on the humble underside of a turtle. The true work, the work of reading and understanding this mountain of text, is just beginning. Lifting one of the complete plastrons from the pit, you cradle it in your hands. It feels cool, dense, and unnervingly smooth, like polished stone. Your focus shifts from the grand scale of the archive to the intimate biography of this single object. Its journey didn't begin in this pit, or even in the hands of a royal diviner. It began in a river or a marsh, hundreds of miles to the south as the living armor of a turtle, and its transformation from biological defense to divine communication tool was a process of meticulous, almost obsessive, craftsmanship. You are no longer just looking at an artifact. You are reverse engineering a sacred technology. The raw materials were highly specific. For the most part, the Shang used the scapulae, or shoulder blades of cattle, and the plastrons, the flat underbellies of turtles. These were chosen for a simple reason. They offered the largest, flattest, and thinnest surfaces available. They were the natural tablets of the animal kingdom. Once the animal was sacrificed or the shell was received as tribute, the real work began in what must have been bustling, noisy, and profoundly smelly workshops on the edge of the ceremonial center. Imagine the scene. Great cauldrons bubble over open fires, boiling the bones and shells to loosen the stubborn flesh and cartilage. You can almost hear the rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of bronze knives as workers meticulously remove every last bit of tissue. You can imagine the job posting. Wanted, royal bone scraper. Must be okay with long hours and, well, a lot of scraping. Future of the kingdom depends on you. No, really. Once cleaned, the bones were left to dry and bleach in the sun until they were sterile and ready for shaping. This was an industrial process. The discovery of the remains of these workshops at Yinshu, littered with bone fragments and specialized tools, proves this wasn't some casual ad hoc activity. It was a state-sponsored enterprise, an assembly line for producing the instruments of prophecy. The shaping process was just as precise. The prominent spinal ridge on each ox scapula was sawed off, creating a more uniform, flat surface. The turtle plastrons were separated from the curved upper shell, the carapace, and their edges were trimmed and smoothed. The goal was to create a standardized canvas, a rectangular slate ready for use. Running your finger along the beveled edge of the plastron in your hands, you can feel the faint marks of the bronze saw and the polishing stone. But the most ingenious and crucial step came next. You turn the plastron over. The side that faced the turtle's internal organs is not smooth like the front. It's covered in a series of carefully carved hollows. These are not decorations. They are the key to the entire divinatory process. Craftsmen using drills with bronze or possibly jade tips would carve two types of connected pits in a neat, ordered series of columns. First, a long, shallow groove, and right next to it, a deeper, round pit. This combination was a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering. It thinned the bone from the inside at a very specific point without marking the smooth outer surface where the script would eventually be carved. The level of precision is astounding. These weren't just random pockmarks. They were a carefully engineered weak point, the ancient equivalent of the tear here perforation on a modern snack bag. They were designed to give the diviners precise control over where the bone would crack when subjected to intense heat. As you examine the plastron more closely, you notice something odd. Faintly, beneath the main inscription on the front, you can just make out the ghostly traces of older characters, almost entirely erased. This shell was reused. It seems that for certain, perhaps less critical divinations, a perfectly good plastron wouldn't be discarded. Instead, the old inscription would be carefully scraped away, the surface polished smooth again, and the shell put back into circulation. It's the ultimate in sustainable spirituality. When you're done asking if you'll win the war against the northern barbarians, you just sand it down and ask if it's going to rain next Tuesday. This practice highlights the immense value placed on high-quality shells. A question forms in your mind, a debate that continues among scholars to this day. Historians still argue whether the preparation of the bones was a purely practical, technical task performed by ordinary craftsmen, or if it was itself a ritual act carried out by specialized priests. Was the man drilling these hollows simply a technician, a skilled laborer in a larger bureaucracy? Or was he a ritual specialist in his own right, imbuing the bone with its sacred potential through his focused, repetitive work? Was every scrape of the knife, every turn of the drill, a prayer? Looking at the almost supernatural neatness of the hollows, it feels like more than just a job. The bone in your hands is no longer a bone. It has been purified, shaped, and engineered. It is a blank page, a loaded die, a primed canvas waiting for the touch of fire and the voice of the spirits. The workshop is left behind. The prepared bone, now a sacred vessel, is brought into the hushed, incense-filled space of the ancestral temple. You are no longer a craftsman, but an officiant in a profound ceremony. The air is heavy, thick with the smoke of burning juniper and fragrant herbs. Bronze ritual vessels, fantastically decorated with the faces of mythical beasts, glimmer in the flickering torchlight. At the center of this solemn theater is the king, who is often the chief diviner himself, the ultimate intermediary between the living and the dead. Before him stands the diviner, a specialist priest, his face a mask of concentration. In his hands he holds the smooth, pale ox scapula you have been following on its journey. The blank slate is about to be written upon, not by ink, but by fire. The King's voice is low and formal as he declares the charge, the topic of the divination. It is a statement, a proposition to be tested against the will of the ancestors. The Fang peoples are attacking our eastern border. I will send 3,000 troops to repel them. Will this be auspicious? He might ask. Or perhaps a more personal concern. The queen's toothache persists. Is it a curse from ancestor Fu Yi? The question hangs in the air, a formal request logged with the powers of the unseen world. A scribe, brush at the ready, waits to record the proceedings. Now the ceremony reaches its apex. An assistant pulls a long bronze rod from a fiery brazier. Its tip glows with a malevolent, shimmering red-orange heat that seems to warp the very air around it. This is not your casual backyard barbecue. You get this wrong. And you don't just get a burnt burger, you get an angry ancestral spirit and possibly a 7-year famine. The diviner takes the glowing brand. You feel a wave of heat wash over you as he brings it close to the back of the scapula, aiming for one of the carefully prepared hollows. He holds it steady, his movements practiced and economical. There is a tense silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. He presses the tip of the brand into the circular pit. For a second, nothing happens. Then a wisp of acrid smoke curls up from the bone, smelling of scorched keratin. And then comes the sound. A sharp, distinct crack. It echoes in the stone chamber. This sound, which the Shang people likely pronounce something like bu, is the voice of the bone. It is the sound of the spirit world picking up the phone. No dial tone, just a direct line to the great beyond. The character for divination itself, bu, is a picture of the very crack that has just appeared. A vertical line intersected by a horizontal one. The diviner immediately withdraws the brand and turns the scapula over. There on the smooth front surface, radiating from the point where the heat was applied, is a fresh, dark fissure. This is the oracle. The diviner leans in close, his eyes tracing the path of the fracture. He is not just looking, he is reading. The angle of the primary crack, the number of smaller fissures branching from it, its length, its depth, all of it is data. Interpreting these cracks is a bit like a Rorschach test. But instead of telling a psychologist about your mother, you're telling a king whether or not to invade the neighboring territory. The stakes are just a little higher. After a long, silent moment of contemplation, the diviner announces the prognostication. Auspicious, he might declare. The ancestors approve of the campaign. Or inauspicious. The queen's illness will linger. On many of the bones you've studied, you've seen tiny characters carved right next to the cracks, noting the interpretation, using the words ji, for auspicious, and jiong for inauspicious. Sometimes the cracks are even numbered, showing that the diviner posed a series of follow-up questions probing for more detail. It's a dialogue captured in fractures, yet you can't help but wonder about the nature of this interpretation. Historians still argue whether the diviner was truly reading the cracks based on an established code, or if the interpretation was a more subjective, performative act influenced by the political needs of the king. Was the diviner a neutral mystic, channeling a divine message? Or was he a canny political advisor, using the authority of the oracle to endorse a decision the king had already made? The truth is likely somewhere in between. The crack has been made, the omen has been read. But the ritual is not yet complete. The blank space next to this newly formed crack now waits for the scribe's knife, ready to be filled with the permanent record of this fleeting conversation with eternity. The diviner's voice fades, but his judgment hangs in the air. Auspicious. Now another figure steps forward from the shadows. It is the scribe. He carries no brush and ink, but a fine-pointed stylus, likely made of bronze, or perhaps even jade for the most important records. With the steadiness of a surgeon, he brings the sharp tip to the surface of the bone, right next to the newly formed crack. A tiny curl of bone dust rises as he begins to carve. He is not writing a story. He is engraving a data point. The fleeting ritual, the heat, the crack, the interpretation, is now being chiseled into permanence. And as you lean in to read the characters he so deftly carves, you gain the most intimate access imaginable to the mind of a Shang king. You learn what a ruler who lived 3 millennia ago truly worried about. The scope of the questions is staggering. They swing wildly from the grandest matters of state to the most mundane and deeply personal anxieties. One moment, you are reading about geopolitics on a continental scale. A king asks, "If we raise an army of 5,000 men to attack the Bafang, will D grant us assistance?" The fate of nations, the lives of thousands of soldiers, hangs on the interpretation of a fissure in a piece of bone. Another shell records a question about agriculture, the bedrock of the kingdom. Will we receive the coming spring rains in time for the millet planting? The next is about state building. The king wishes to build a new settlement to the west. If we proceed, will it be a success in the coming 10-day week? These are the great existential questions that occupy any ruler. But then, nestled right alongside these monumental concerns, you find the king's private life laid bare. You read a small, meticulously carved inscription next to a tiny crack. The king's toothaches, that's it. It's strangely comforting to know that 3,000 years before modern dentistry, one of the most powerful men in the world, a man who could command armies and build cities, had to appeal to cosmic beings for advice on a toothache. You can almost hear the ancestor spirit sighing, "Have you tried flossing, Your Majesty?" You find questions about the Queen's health, Lady Howe's childbirth. Will it be good? You see a father's worry for his child. The prince has a sickness in his gut. Will he recover? The archives cover everything from massive military campaigns to the king's weird dream about a talking goat. It is like reading a combination of the Pentagon's strategic plans and the celebrity gossip column from the same document. One of the most common categories of divination gives you a unique insight into the rhythm of Shang life. This was the query concerning the Exun, a 10-day period that functioned as the Shang week. At the end of every Exun, the king would routinely ask, "In the next 10 days, will there be disaster?" It was a ritualized clearing of the cosmic calendar, an attempt to get a forecast for the immediate future. This was the world's first weekly weather forecast, and its accuracy was probably about the same as the one on your phone today, but with way more spiritual gravitas. You even find questions that read like divine paternity tests, with the king asking which ancestor had graced his consort with a pregnancy, a way of ritually confirming the child's place in the all-important royal lineage. As you read more and more of these charges, you notice a peculiar linguistic pattern. The questions are rarely open-ended, like "what should I do?" Instead, they are almost always phrased as a proposition, often in both a positive and negative form. "We will attack the fang," might be on one side of the bone, and "we will not attack the fang" on the other, with a separate crack made for each. This leads to a major scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the questions were genuine inquiries into the unknown, or if they were a form of political theater designed to sanctify decisions the king had already made. By phrasing the charge as a statement to be confirmed, the king wasn't asking for advice. He was seeking a divine rubber stamp for his intended policy. It was a way of manufacturing consent, not from the people but from the gods themselves. The king wasn't just speaking to the ancestors, he was managing them. And this complex process of management required a team of highly trained spiritual technicians. You've read the king's mind, seen his fears and his ambitions etched in bone. But the king was not alone in that smoky temple. He was surrounded by a team of highly specialized professionals, the men who made the entire system of divine communication possible. These were the diviners, the Zhenren, and as you sift through thousands of inscriptions, you start to recognize their names, their individual quirks, and their immense, shadowy influence. They are the king's spiritual technicians, and their job was one of the most powerful and precarious in the entire kingdom. Their LinkedIn profiles would have been fascinating. Part priest, part political advisor, part materials engineer. These were not wild-eyed mystics in a trance. The inscriptions reveal them to be members of a highly organized, literate elite. Scholars have identified the names of more than 120 individual diviners who served the Shang kings. You can even group them into distinct schools based on their handwriting, their phrasing of the charges, and the kings they served. The diviners of the Bin group, for instance, were the trusted advisors to the great King Wu Ding, their names appearing again. Imagine the daily routine of a senior diviner named Bin. He arrives at the temple complex at dawn. His first task is to review the schedule of divinations for the day. The king wants to know about the upcoming millet harvest. A general is seeking approval for a military campaign, and a royal consort is due to give birth. Each requires a different type of bone, a different ancestral spirit to be invoked, a different level of ritual preparation. Bin must confer with the king, helping him phrase the charges in the precise formal language required for a successful communion with the spirits. It's a delicate dance of theology, linguistics, and politics. Then comes the ritual itself, with Bin expertly applying the heated brand, reading the cryptic cracks and declaring the prognostication with an air of absolute authority. Imagine the pressure. Your boss is the king, and the king's boss is the ghost of his great-great-grandfather, who is apparently very picky about sacrificial oxen. It would be a tough performance review. The power these men wielded was immense. They were the gatekeepers, the ones who translated the silent language of the gods into actionable intelligence for the king. This proximity to the divine and the monarch gave them a central role in the politics of the court. Their interpretation of an omen could launch an army or delay a critical project, and you find evidence that their job was not always straightforward. On some bones, You see the same question being asked on the same day, but by two different diviners. It's the divine equivalent of going to two different doctors for the same diagnosis. Diviner Bin says the ancestors approved the attack, but I want to see what Diviner Zheng thinks. His office has better incense. This suggests a complex internal process, perhaps a verification, or maybe even political maneuvering, with different factions in the court seeking different answers from the spirit world. This complexity fuels a central question. Historians still argue about the precise relationship between the king and his diviners. Was the diviner an independent religious authority who could challenge the king, a kind of prophet who spoke truth to power? Or was he essentially a high-status civil servant, a functionary whose job was to ensure the ritual apparatus confirmed the king's pre-existing decisions? Could a diviner look the king in the eye and say, "The omen is inauspicious, Your Majesty. The ancestors forbid this action"? Or was his role simply to find the auspicious crack, to provide the cosmic justification the king required? The answer is probably lost in the smoke of those temple fires, but the bones suggest a symbiotic relationship, a king who needed supernatural legitimacy and a class of priests who derived their power from providing it. And to ensure the legitimacy of the process, they followed a remarkably consistent formula, a strict protocol for how each divination was to be recorded for posterity. To truly appreciate the oracle bones, you have to see them not just as mystical objects, but as bureaucratic documents. The inscriptions are not random scribbles. They follow a surprisingly rigid and logical format. A complete record is a masterclass in data management, a structured report on a transaction with the supernatural. This isn't just a quick text to the ancestors. It's a formally filled-out government form, sent in triplicate. You can imagine a celestial clerk rejecting one because the diviner forgot to use the correct date stamp. As you examine a perfectly preserved turtle plastron, you can dissect the anatomy of a complete prophecy, which consists of 4 distinct parts. First comes the preface. This is the metadata, the who, when, and where of the divination. It almost always begins with the date, recorded using the complex 60-day cycle of the Shang calendar. An inscription might start on the day Guisi, which is the 30th day of the cycle. This is followed by the name of the diviner who is performing the ritual. The Diviner Bin. Cracking. This tells you who is on duty. So, in just a few characters, you have established the precise day and the official responsible for the communication. It's the header of a memo, grounding the mystical inquiry in a specific recorded moment in time. Next is the heart of the matter, the charge. This is the question or proposition that was formally declared by the king before the crack was made. It's the reason for the entire ceremony. Following our example, the scribe would carve, "The king charges, in the next 10 days, there will be no disaster." This is the testable hypothesis, the statement laid before the ancestors for their approval or disapproval. As we've seen, it's often phrased in both positive and negative forms to cover all the bases. The third part is the prognostication. After the crack was made, the diviner, and sometimes the king himself, would interpret its meaning and declare the outcome. The scribe would then record this official reading. This section is often introduced with the words, "The king, reading the cracks, said." You have to love the king chiming in with his own reading of the cracks. It's the ultimate "let me speak to the manager" moment, but the manager is a 300-year-old ghost. The interpretation might be a simple auspicious, or it could be more nuanced, something like auspicious. There may be a minor alarming event, but no great harm. This was the official prediction, the divine forecast based on the data of the crack. Then comes the fourth and, for a historian, the most electrifying part, the verification. This was an addendum, often carved days or even weeks later in a slightly different script that recorded what actually happened. It was the follow-up, the empirical test of the prophecy. An entry might read, "On the 8th day of the week, Gangzi, it did indeed rain." Or more dramatically, "After 9 days the Northern Army launched a raid and captured 10 of our men. The omen was fulfilled." Not all bones have a verification. Perhaps it was only recorded for significant or ambiguous prophecies, but when they do, they are pure gold. They transform the bone from a record of belief into a record of events. What's truly remarkable is the honesty of these verifications. Sometimes they directly contradict the prognostication. The diviner might have declared a venture auspicious, but the verification grimly notes a terrible defeat. This suggests a stunning commitment to accurate record-keeping, a willingness to document failures as well as successes. The verification is my favorite part. It's like a product review for a prophecy. The oracle predicted a sunny week. It rained frogs for 3 days. 1 star. Would not consult again. This integrity leads to a fascinating scholarly puzzle. Historians still argue about the purpose of the verification. Was it a quasi-scientific attempt to test and refine the divinatory system? To see which ancestors gave the most reliable advice? Or was it a more complex theological exercise, designed to show that any outcome, good or bad, ultimately confirmed the power and inscrutable wisdom of the spirits? Were they trying to debug the system or simply rationalize its glitches? Whatever the reason, this complex 4-part structure reveals a mindset that was both deeply religious and surprisingly empirical. And it was all made possible by the single most important technology the Shang possessed: a sophisticated, versatile, and elegant system of writing. The meticulous 4-part structure you've been examining is the grammar of prophecy, but the characters themselves are the vocabulary. As your eyes adjust to the ancient scratches, you begin to appreciate the sheer genius of the writing system itself. What you're looking at, this Jiagyuan or shell and bone script, is the oldest known form of Chinese writing. It is the great-great-great-grandfather of the characters used by over 1 billion people today. And the family resemblance is, in many cases, still strikingly clear. But don't let its age fool you into thinking it's primitive. This is not some beginner's alphabet with 26 letters. This is a fully fledged system that came out of the gate ready for its doctoral dissertation. It's the James Brown of writing systems. It was born funky and sophisticated with a complex structure and a massive vocabulary, suggesting a long hidden period of development on materials like wood or bamboo that have long since turned to dust. At its heart, the script is pictographic. The earliest and simplest characters are charmingly direct drawings of the world. You see a character that looks like a stick figure with legs and arms, and you know it means Ren, person. You see a simple sketch of a tree with branches and roots. Mu, tree. A stylized drawing of 3 mountain peaks becomes Shan, mountain. Some of the pictographs are so clear, it feels like you're reading a 3,000-year-old game of Pictionary. Okay, it's a stick figure with a big head. A man. Okay, now a squiggly line, river. You're good at this. But a writing system based purely on pictures has its limits. How do you draw up or 3 or rest? This is where the genius of the Shang scribes becomes apparent, as they developed more abstract principles. For a concept like up, they drew a flat horizontal line representing the ground and put a smaller vertical line above it. Shang. For down, they simply put the small line below. Xia. These are called ideographs, representing an idea rather than a direct image. They also started combining pictures to create new meanings, like a logographic form of chemistry. You take the character for tree mu, and you put another one next to it, mu, to create lin, meaning woods. If you need a dense, dark forest, you just add a third tree, sen. My favorite is the character for rest, xiu. It's a combination of the character for a person, ren, leaning against the character for a tree, mu. It's a tiny, elegant poem about finding shelter and peace, all embedded in a single character. But the real quantum leap, the principle that allowed the script to grow exponentially and describe a complex world, was the creation of phonosemantic compounds. This sounds complicated, but the idea is simple and brilliant. You combine 2 characters, one to give a clue about the meaning, and one to give a clue about the sound. For example, the character for horse, ma, is a clear pictograph. But what if you want to write the word mother, which was also pronounced ma? You take the character for horse ma, for the sound, and you add the character for woman, nu, on the side to give the meaning. The result is ma, the modern character for mom. This innovation was a game changer, allowing the Shang to create new characters for new words with an efficient and logical system. By the time you're examining these bones, the script already contains an estimated 4,500 unique characters. It's a massive, mature system. One of its charming quirks, however, is a lack of standardization. A character might be written facing left or right. The components of a compound character might be stacked vertically in one inscription and arranged horizontally in another. It had a fluid, calligraphic freedom that later scripts would sacrifice for uniformity. Historians still argue about what came before the oracle bone script. Were there even earlier, more pictorial forms of writing on Neolithic pottery that eventually evolved into this system? Or was writing a relatively sudden invention, a killer app developed specifically for the high-stakes ritual communication of the Shang court? We simply don't have the evidence. The oracle bones emerge from the historical fog fully formed, leaving us to wonder about their mysterious childhood. And of the 4,500 characters they left behind, only about half have been confidently deciphered. The rest remain silent, their meanings lost to time. They are the ancient equivalent of that one weird emoji on your phone that nobody knows what it's really for. The immense challenge of bridging that 3,000-year gap, of learning to read these characters again, is one of the great detective stories of modern scholarship. You are no longer in the Shang temple. You are in a quiet library centuries later, a single fragment of inscribed bone on a velvet cloth before you. The smoke of the ancient ritual has been replaced by the faint, dusty smell of old books. Your task is, in some ways, even more daunting than the diviner's. He had to interpret the will of the gods. You have to interpret the will of the scribe. You must learn to read a language that has been silent for over 3,000 years. Deciphering oracle bone script is like trying to solve a crossword puzzle where half the clues are missing. The other half are in a dead language, and the grid was designed by a ghost. No pressure. There is no Rosetta Stone, no convenient side-by-side translation to give you a key. The only tool you have is the script itself, and the long, winding road of its evolution. Your first foothold, your base camp on this Everest of epigraphy, is the pictograph. You look for the characters that are still recognizably drawings. You see the stick figure for man, Ren, the tree with its branches, Mu, the 3 peaks of a mountain, Shan. You recognize them because they bear a family resemblance to their descendants in later Chinese scripts. By tracing these simple characters forward through time from the Shang oracle bones to the Zhou bronzes, to the seal script of the Qin dynasty, and onto the scripts of the Han, you can build a bridge across the millennia. This gives you a small but crucial vocabulary of nouns, the tangible objects of the Shang world. With this basic lexicon, you can begin to attack the rest of the puzzle using the context of the inscriptions themselves. You find a sentence where you can read every character except one. It says, "The king will hunt in the western forest and will capture many unknown character." You look at the mystery character. It looks a bit like a deer with prominent antlers. You've just made a very good guess that you've found the character for deer. It's a process of long, frustrating hours punctuated by sudden moments of, aha. You'll stare at a character for months, and then one day you'll see a picture of a pig in a field and realize the character is a stylized drawing of a pig in a field, and you feel like a genius for spotting the obvious. You also learn to recognize patterns. You notice a certain character appears again and again, but only in inscriptions from the reign of King Wu Ding. It's often followed by characters meaning childbirth or lead army. You hypothesize this is a name, a proper noun. This is how the name of Fu Hao, the king's powerful consort, was first identified. Decades later, when archaeologists found her untouched tomb filled with treasures, the inscriptions on the bronze vessels confirmed her identity. The decipherment was proven correct, a stunning victory for the linguistic detectives. This was how the great early scholars men like Wang Guowei managed to reconstruct the entire Shang royal genealogy from the bones, proving that the ancient historian Sima Qian's king list was not a myth, but a stunningly accurate record. As your skills grow, you can even dissect the phono-semantic compounds. You learn to spot the recurring components that provide clues to meaning and sound, reverse engineering the logic of the scribes who created them. But some characters reveal their meaning in a much more direct, and sometimes brutal, fashion. You see a character that shows a hand grabbing a person, it means to capture. Another shows a person kneeling before a large bronze vessel, possibly a pictogram for a ritual offering. The arguments over the meaning of a single character can fill entire books. It's the academic version of a bare-knuckle brawl, fought with footnotes and linguistic analysis instead of fists. Even after a century of intense study by some of the world's brilliant minds, about half of the 4,500 known characters remain undeciphered. And even among the known characters, the precise meaning of key terms is still hotly contested. Historians still argue fiercely over the exact meaning of some key theological terms, like the name of the high god, D. Does it refer to a single, all-powerful sky god, the collective spiritual power of all the royal ancestors, or the deified concept of kingship itself? We can read the word, but we are still struggling to understand the full weight of the concept. But what is not in doubt is the wealth of information the deciphered characters have given us. They don't just speak of kings and gods, they speak of rain, wind, sun, and snow. They give us an unintentional but remarkably detailed record of the world in which the Shang people lived. Now that you can read the script, you begin to collate the data, and an astonishing, unintended picture emerges. The Shang kings, in their relentless effort to manage their relationship with the spirit world, were also, by complete accident, the world's first systematic weather observers. They weren't interested in climatology. They were interested in appeasing the ancestors who they believed controlled the rain, wind, and sun. Their survival depended on it. The result is a 3,000-year-old weather report of incredible detail and duration. They asked about rain so often you get the feeling that if the Shang had modern television, the Weather Channel would have been the highest-rated network in the kingdom, 24/7. You pore over thousands of fragments, and the same questions appear with the rhythm of the seasons. On the day Jia Z, cracking, will it rain today? And, crucially, the verification, carved in a smaller script a day or two later. It did indeed rain. They had different words for different kinds of rain, distinguishing between a light sprinkle and a torrential downpour. They were obsessed with receiving sufficient rain for the millet and wheat crops that formed the foundation of their state. They also tracked the wind. Will the wind be from the east, they'd ask? The wind wasn't just a meteorological phenomenon. It was the breath of the spirits. An auspicious wind could bring nourishing rain, while an inauspicious one could carry dust storms or crop-killing drought. They recorded the sun, the snow, the frost, and the fog. These aren't vague prophecies. They're specific. Will it rain on Tuesday? The verification then notes, it rained on Tuesday afternoon. It's like the universe's most detail-oriented personal assistant. When you compile all these daily data points, tens of thousands of them over a period of more than 2 centuries, you can move beyond weather to climate. You can reconstruct the environmental conditions of the North China Plain in 1200 BCE. And the results are startling. The sheer frequency of questions about rain, combined with other archaeological and geological evidence, points to a single, inescapable conclusion. The climate of the Shang Dynasty was significantly warmer and wetter than it is today. This period is now known to scientists as the Shang Dynasty megathermal period. Anyang, which today has a temperate semi-arid climate, was then much closer to a humid subtropical environment. The winters were milder, the summers rainier. The landscape was likely far lusher and greener than its modern-day counterpart. This different climate profoundly shaped the Shang world. The Yellow River, which they simply called He, the river, was an even more formidable force of nature than it is today. They saw it as a powerful deity, a spirit that had to be constantly placated with sacrifices to prevent catastrophic floods. You read divinations addressed directly to the river spirit, offering up oxen or prisoners of war in the hopes of keeping its destructive power in check. It is a stark reminder that their world was one where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was porous, where a river was not just a body of water, but a living, temperamental god. This reconstruction of the ancient climate has also ignited a major historical debate. It is clear that towards the end of the Shang Dynasty, the climate began to change. This warm, wet period started to end, and conditions became progressively cooler and drier. Historians and paleoclimatologists still argue about the primary driver of the Shang's eventual decline and their conquest by the Zhou around 1046 BCE. Was it purely the result of political corruption and military defeat, as traditional Chinese histories have long maintained? Or was this political decay exacerbated or even caused by a major climatic shift that strained their agricultural base, leading to famine, social unrest, and a weakening of the state's power? It seems arguing about whether climate change is to blame for the fall of a civilization is not a new hobby. The Shang just did it with more sacrifices and fewer angry comments on the internet. And this warmer, wetter world they inhabited was not just home to different weather, it was home to a very different cast of creatures. The climate data tells you it was warmer and wetter, but it's an abstract fact, a line on a graph. The reality of that climate, the living, breathing texture of it, comes to you through the animals. As you continue to read the inscriptions, you find yourself in the middle of a lost world, a wilder, lusher, and more dangerous version of North China. The king, it turns out, was an avid and obsessive hunter, and he divined about his hunting expeditions constantly. These records, along with the pictographic nature of the script itself, provide you with a stunningly detailed field guide to the fauna of the 13th century BCE. And it is not what you would expect. This wasn't just a slightly different climate. This was a whole different biome. You'd be expecting to see a wheat field, and instead, you'd find an elephant stepping on your prize-winning melons. A very different set of gardening challenges. You read an inscription. The king will hunt at the foot of the western mountain. Will we capture elephants? You have to read it twice. Elephants, in the Yellow River Valley. The character for elephant, Xiang, is one of the most beautiful and unambiguous pictographs, a perfect little drawing of a creature with a massive body, big ears, and a long, curving trunk. The inscriptions are clear. The Shang not only hunted elephants for their meat and ivory, but they also captured them alive. This has led to a fascinating debate. Historians and archaeologists still argue about the extent of elephant domestication during the Shang. Were they just a source of exotic materials, or were they actively tamed and used for labor, perhaps even warfare, as they were in other parts of ancient Asia? The bones don't give a definitive answer, but they place these magnificent beasts firmly in the landscape. Then you find another character, Xrars, rhinoceros. Again, the texts mention them as prey in the royal hunts. Their thick, tough hides were particularly prized for making armor for the Shang elite soldiers. The idea of armored rhinos roaming the bamboo groves that must have flourished in the region's wetter climate completely upends the modern image of the landscape. And the danger didn't stop there. The character for tiger, Hu, is another vivid pictograph, and tigers were a constant presence, a symbol of power and a terrifying threat. The king's hunting diary reads like the world's most dangerous zookeeping job. Tuesday, bagged 30 boars. Wednesday, captured a live rhinoceros. Thursday, fought a tiger lost. Friday, paperwork. The menagerie is confirmed by the archaeological record. Shang tombs are filled with intricate carvings made from elephant ivory. Bronze ritual vessels from the period are often shaped like elephants, tigers, and most famously, rhinoceroses, their forms rendered with a startling, intimate realism that could only come from first-hand observation. This lost ecosystem tells a poignant story of environmental change. As the climate cooled and dried towards the end of the Shang and into the subsequent Zhou Dynasty, these great beasts, dependent on a warm, wet, bamboo-rich environment, began to disappear. Their habitat shrank, and they were pushed further and further south, out of the historical heartland of Chinese civilization. This retreat is fossilized in the language itself. The character for elephant, Xiang, the pictograph for that once common animal, underwent a fascinating transformation. As actual elephants became a rarity, a thing seen only in pictures or heard about in stories, the character Xiang took on a new, more abstract meaning. Image, likeness, or phenomenon. It's like the animal became so rare it turned into a myth, a picture of its former self. If the word dinosaur eventually just came to mean old movie, so you sit back and picture the world the diviner saw. It is a world where the king's hunting party might track a herd of wild water buffalo through a marshy wetland, startling leopards and wild boars in the reeds. It is a world where the farmers in their millet fields had to worry about their crops being trampled not by deer, but by elephants. It's a world teeming with a wildness that is now gone from that land. This rich, vibrant, and dangerous natural world was, in the Shang mind, simply the visible layer of reality. Interfused with it, and in many ways controlling it, was a far more complex world of spirits, ancestors, and gods. You have mapped the ancient climate and catalogued the vanished beasts. Now you must map the unseen world that, to the Shang, was more real and far more important than either. As you read the invocations and charges, you realize you are not dealing with a simple pantheon of gods like the Greeks or Egyptians. You are exploring a complex spiritual hierarchy, a celestial government that mirrored the bureaucracy on Earth. This spiritual world had two main branches. At the top, a remote and all-powerful high god named Dai, and below him, a noisy, demanding, and influential assembly of royal ancestors. Communication with this government was the primary function of the state. At the apex of it all sits Dai. The character Dai is the same one that would later be used by the emperors of China. Di is the supreme being, the ultimate source of authority. He commands the rain, the wind, and the harvest. He grants victory in battle and can visit famine and disaster upon the land. But he is a distant, almost aloof figure. You notice a crucial pattern in the thousands of divinations. The Shang king almost never addresses Di directly. There are no inscriptions that say, "O Di, please grant us rain." Di was the ultimate absentee landlord of the cosmos. You couldn't call him directly. You had to go through his family, the ancestors, who acted as a kind of supernatural homeowners association. The king's power came from his unique ability to communicate with his ancestors, who could then, in turn, petition Di on the kingdom's behalf. These ancestors, the Zhu, were the second, more accessible tier of the spirit world. These are the ghosts of recently deceased Shang kings and their principal wives, figures like the formidable Fu Hao. They are the true audience for most of the divinations. While Dai controlled the grand sweep of destiny, the ancestors managed the day-to-day affairs of the royal family. They were the intermediaries, the lobbyists in the court of heaven. But you quickly learn that these were not gentle, benevolent spirits. The Shang ancestors were less like guardian angels and more like grumpy, ghostly in-laws. They were powerful, capricious, and endlessly demanding. They had to be constantly informed, consulted, and above all, fed. If they were pleased, they would convey the king's requests to Dai and bestow good fortune. But if they were displeased, if their sacrifices were late or insufficient, they would actively cause trouble. That royal toothache, it was a curse from a neglected ancestor. The queen's difficult childbirth, the meddling of a jealous great-aunt's spirit. This entire system was profoundly transactional. It was a contract between the living and the dead. The king provided a steady stream of magnificent offerings, and in return, the ancestors provided protection and divine favor. This ancestor cult is perhaps the Shang's most enduring legacy, the cultural DNA that would inform Chinese society for millennia to come. The bones you are reading are the earliest written evidence of this foundational pillar of Chinese civilization, and it was all structured like a bureaucracy. You can just imagine one ancestor spirit telling another, "Look, I'd love to help the king with his harvest, but the request form for rain has to be approved by Dai's office, and you know how slow they are." Alongside these two main branches, you also find mentions of lesser nature deities, the spirit of the river, the spirits of the sacred mountains, the sun and the wind, who seem to be department heads in charge of their own specific domains. Yet, for all this detail, the ultimate identity of the high god remains shrouded in mystery, fueling one of the biggest debates in the field. Historians still argue about the precise identity of Dai. Was Di a singular, primordial sky god who existed before the Shang came to power? Or was the name a collective term for the entire ancestral host? Or, perhaps most intriguingly, did it refer to the very first founding ancestor of the Shang royal line, a man so ancient and powerful he had been elevated to the status of a supreme deity? The bones don't give us a clear answer. They only show us a king, trapped in a web of obligations to his divine superiors, constantly working to keep them happy. and the primary method for ensuring that happiness was the solemn and often grim practice of sacrifice. The spiritual world of the Shang was not a place of quiet contemplation. It was a hungry, demanding entity that required constant feeding. The relationship you've uncovered, this contract between the king and his ancestors, was paid for with a steady stream of offerings. You read the inscriptions and see the word Gigi, sacrifice, appear more than almost any other. The logic was simple and direct. The spirits and ancestors, just like the living, needed sustenance to survive and thrive. A well-fed ancestor was a happy ancestor. A hungry ancestor was a dangerous one, prone to causing droughts, famines, and toothaches. The price of a good harvest, a successful military campaign, or even the birth of a healthy heir was paid in blood. The most common currency was livestock. The budget for the Department of Ancestor Appeasement must have been astronomical. You can imagine the royal treasurer sighing, "Another request for 300 white oxen? Don't they know we have a deficit?" Cattle, sheep, pigs, and even dogs were sacrificed in staggering numbers. The inscriptions are incredibly specific. They don't just say sacrifice an ox. They say, sacrifice 30 white oxen by burning or boil a dozen unblemished sheep as an offering to ancestor Ding. The spirits were apparently very picky eaters. No, I asked for a white bull, not a spotted one. This completely ruins the omen. It's the divine equivalent of sending your food back at a restaurant. This ritualized slaughter represented a colossal expenditure of the kingdom's wealth. An ox was a tractor, a source of food, and a sign of prosperity. To burn hundreds of them on a single altar was a profound statement of the king's piety and power. But as you delve deeper into the archives, you confront a much grimmer reality. You find divinations that ask, for the right to the river spirit, should we sacrifice 10 Chang men? Or, to dedicate the new ancestral temple, we will offer 100 prisoners. This is Renji, human sacrifice, and it was a central state-sponsored institution of the Shang Dynasty. The unemotional, bureaucratic language of the inscriptions makes the practice all the more chilling. The victims are tallied like any other resource. The primary source for these victims was the Chang, a tribal people to the west with whom the Shang were in a near constant state of war. The Shang king's foreign policy with the Chang people seems to have had only one plank: hostile takeover and subsequent donation to the celestial bureaucracy. The scale of this practice is difficult to comprehend. Single ceremonies could involve the ritual killing of dozens or even hundreds of people. The archaeological pits at Yinshu confirm this textual evidence in the most brutal way imaginable, containing the headless skeletons of thousands of victims, buried in neat, ordered rows. These were the ultimate offerings, the highest price that could be paid to secure divine favor or to avert a catastrophic disaster. On top of these mass sacrifices, you also find evidence of human companions, servants, and retainers who were killed and buried in the tombs of their elite masters, destined to serve them in the afterlife. This organized, large-scale killing forces you to grapple with a difficult question, one that scholars are still wrestling with. Historians still argue about the primary motivation for the immense scale of human sacrifice. Was it driven purely by religious piety, a genuine and desperate belief that the gods demanded this price and that the fate of the kingdom depended on paying it? Or was it also a calculated and ruthless act of political theater? A way for the king to demonstrate his absolute power, to terrorize his enemies, and to unify his own people through shared violent ritual. Was this theology? Or was it terrorism? Or was it some inseparable combination of both? The bones do not offer a clear motive. They only record the questions and the cold, hard numbers. They show you a world where the lives of enemies were a disposable resource, a currency to be spent in the high-stakes marketplace of divine favor. And the man authorizing these expenditures, the one making these life and death decisions, was the king himself. The sheer scale of the sacrifices, the weight of the kingdom's fate, the constant demands of the ancestors, it all rested on the shoulders of one man. And thanks to the incredible wealth of inscriptions from Pit H3, you can get closer to this one man than to almost any other figure from the ancient world. You can step inside the mind of King Wu Ding. He reigned for 59 years during the 13th century BCE. a period considered the zenith of Shang power. And the thousands of bones from his time paint a portrait of a ruler beset by a constant, nagging anxiety, a man for whom no problem was too large or too small to consult the spirits. Reading. Wu Ding's divinations is like doom scrolling through the social media feed of the world's most powerful and anxious man. One minute it's a war, the next it's a toothache, then it's a weird dream. The guy needed a vacation. As king, his public worries were immense. His reign was one of constant military expansion and defense. You read charge after charge about his campaigns against the Tufang to the north and the Gongfang to the west. He asks, should General X lead the attack? Is it auspicious to dispatch 5,000 troops? Will we capture the enemy chieftains? He is a hands-on commander-in-chief, meticulously planning his strategies with the input of his ancestral war council. He worries about the harvest, the lifeblood of his kingdom, asking endlessly about rain, drought, and locust plagues. He is also the manager of a nascent empire, divining about whether his allies will remain loyal and if his vassals will deliver their tribute of grain, cattle, and of course the precious turtle shells needed for the divinations themselves. But it's his private anxieties that collapse the 3,000-year distance between you and him. Wu Ding, the mighty king, was also a man who suffered from toothaches, ringing in his ears, and sore feet, and he took all these complaints to the spirit world. More poignantly, he was a husband and a father. You see his deep and abiding concern for one of his many consorts, a woman named Fu Hao, or Lady Hao. He asks the ancestors about her illnesses, her recurring headaches. You can see him worrying about her. He asks about her pregnancies with an almost tender solicitude. Fu Hao's childbirth, will it be good? It's the 3,000-year-old equivalent of anxiously texting your partner to see if they got home okay. He even divines about his dreams, asking if a particular nightmare was a sign of a looming curse from a displeased ancestor. This is not a remote, godlike pharaoh. This is a human being grappling with the universal fears of pain, loss, and the unknown. The sheer detail of his inquiries is astounding. The level of detail in some questions makes you think Wu Ding was a serious micromanager. You half expect to find a bone that says, I am thinking of rearranging the furniture in the West Wing. Will Ancestor Yi approve of the new feng shui? This has led to a debate among historians. Was Wu Ding truly dictating the exact wording of these hundreds upon hundreds of questions himself, controlling every aspect of the ritual? Or did he set the daily agenda, war, harvest, the queen's health, and then leave the procedural details to his trusted team of professional diviners, men like Bin and Zheng, whose names appear so frequently in the records? The truth is likely a mix of both. A deeply involved king working in tandem with his spiritual cabinet. What is clear is that during his long reign, the Shang Dynasty flourished. His anxieties were matched by his energy, and his constant consultation with the ancestors seems to have resulted in a period of great success and stability. But of all the figures who populate the world of his divinations, the one who stands out most is the one he worried about so often. Fu Hao was not just a royal wife and mother. As the oracle bones reveal, she was a landowner, a ritual officiant, and most remarkably, one of the king's most trusted military commanders. The story of this powerful woman, once just a name recurring in the king's worried questions, would eventually be brought to light in the most spectacular way imaginable. For decades after the first oracle bones were deciphered, Fu Hao was a ghost, a name whispered from the past. You see her through the eyes of her husband, King Wu Ding, as a figure of great importance and a source of constant concern. But as you collate all the divinations that mention her, you realize she was far more than just a beloved wife. The bones reveal a woman of extraordinary power and influence, a figure who shatters any simple preconception of what a queen's role might have been in the Bronze Age. Her resume would be unbelievable. Skills: ritual specialist, estate management, commanding armies of 13,000, defeating enemies of the state. Hobbies: collecting jade and bronze mirrors. The inscriptions show her first and foremost as a major player in the religious life of the court. Unlike other consorts, Fu Hao was empowered to conduct her own divinations and offer some of the most important sacrifices to the ancestors, a role usually reserved for the king himself. This gave her a direct line to the spirit world and thus immense authority. The bones also refer to her personal estates, lands that were hers to command, suggesting she was a wealthy landowner with her own independent source of income and power. But the most shocking revelation is her military career. You read an inscription, and the king's charge is breathtaking. "I charge that Fu Hao will raise troops and attack the Tufang." In another, he asks the oracle to grant her victory as she leads an army of 13,000 soldiers, alongside another general, against the Chang. This was a massive military force for the time, and Fu Hao was its commander. The verifications attached to these divinations confirm her success. She was a victorious general for the Shang state. You look at the inscriptions about her battle record, and you realize Wu Ding wasn't just worried about her catching a cold. He was worried about her going into battle, and from the looks of it, the enemy states were worried too. For years, this was all that was known, a powerful text-based portrait of a warrior queen. But all the grand royal tombs at Yinshu had been plundered centuries ago. Her final resting place, and the physical proof of her existence, was presumed lost forever. Then in 1976, Chinese archaeologists were excavating a patch of seemingly unimportant ground near the old palace foundations when a shovel hit something hard. It was the top of a tomb, but one that was not located in the main royal cemetery. As they carefully cleared the earth, they realized they had found something unique. A tomb that was smaller than the great king's tombs, but which was, miraculously, completely intact. It had been missed by every grave robber for more than 3 millennia. Finding Fu Hao's unlooted tomb is the archaeological equivalent of winning the lottery, finding a unicorn, and discovering a new season of your favorite canceled TV show all on the same day. As they began to lift the treasures from the earth, they found what they were looking for. On the magnificent bronze ritual vessels, some of the finest ever discovered, was the inscription they knew so well from the oracle bones. Fu Hao. The ghost from the archives had a grave. The contents were a perfect match for the life described in the divinations. There were hundreds of bronze vessels, confirming her high ritual status. There were more than 750 jade objects, attesting to her immense wealth. And most importantly, there were over 130 bronze weapons, not miniatures, but full-size tools of war, including several enormous Yue battle axes, the Shang symbol of military command. This was the arsenal of a general. Yet alongside these emblems of power were more than 500 carved bone hairpins and a collection of bronze mirrors, the personal effects of an elite woman of fashion. The discovery of Tomb 5 was a watershed moment, a perfect marriage of text and archaeology. The life story sketched out in the scattered oracle bones was proven in stunning detail by the contents of a single unlooted tomb. This raises a tantalizing question for historians. Was Fu Hao a complete anomaly, a singular woman whose talent and the king's favor allowed her to break the mold? Or does her extraordinary career suggest that elite Shang women, at least in this period, had far greater access to military, political, and economic power than was previously imagined? The wealth in her tomb, the bronze, the jade, the ivory, was the product of a complex and powerful state economy, an economy that the oracle bones also, in their own way, allow us to explore. The magnificent bronzes and jades you saw in Fu Hao's tomb were not just works of art. They were the end products of a complex and powerful economic system. The oracle bones, in their endless questioning about the kingdom's welfare, act as a kind of royal ledger, giving you glimpses into a world of tribute, harvests, and state-controlled industry. You are no longer just a historian or an archaeologist. You are now an economist, reconstructing the material basis of Shang power from these fragmented receipts of divine consultation. At the very foundation of the Shang state, supporting everything else, was agriculture. The primary crop, mentioned again and again in the divinations, was millet. Millet was the foundation of everything. It might not be as glamorous as a battle axe, but without a good millet harvest, you couldn't feed the soldiers to wield the battle axes or the craftsmen to cast them. It was the humble but essential superstar of the Shang economy. The king's obsession with rain, his constant questions about floods and pests, all stemmed from the existential importance of the grain harvest. The divinations read like the anxious notes of a national farm manager. Will we receive sufficient grain this season? Is the offering to the ancestors adequate to ensure a good harvest? The entire state held its breath in time with the agricultural cycle. This agricultural surplus, however, was not the only source of the king's wealth. The Shang economy ran on a vast tribute system. The central state at Anyang was the hub of a network of allied and vassal lords, each of whom owed the king a regular payment of goods and resources. The tribute system was the ancient version of a subscription box, but instead of artisanal coffee, the king got turtle shells and bronze ingots. And if you unsubscribed, he sent Fu Hao and her army to have a word with you. You read divinations confirming this flow of goods. Will the Marquis of Wei successfully deliver his tribute of 300 turtle plastrons? The southern territories, will they send the required bronze? This system funneled the wealth of a huge geographical area into the capital, providing the king with the strategic materials he needed to maintain power. And the most strategic material of all was bronze. The production of bronze was a royal monopoly, the Bronze Age equivalent of controlling nuclear technology. The king alone controlled the mines for copper and tin and the massive state-run foundries that produced the alloy. This bronze was not used for making farming tools. It was far too valuable. It was used for only two things: casting the weapons that equipped the Shang armies, and creating the magnificent ritual vessels used to communicate with the ancestors. Bronze was the tangible substance of state power, both secular and religious. This palace economy, where the king controlled the production and redistribution of all key resources, is what allowed him to fund his armies, reward his nobles, and create the breathtaking treasures like those buried with Fu Hao. As you scan the inscriptions, you also notice a curious character, a pictograph of a small sea snail. This is the cowrie shell. These shells, imported from the distant shores of the South China Sea or even the Indian Ocean, were used as a form of currency or a marker of wealth. It's amazing that their word for money was based on a seashell they had to import from 1,000 miles away. It's like if our dollar sign was a tiny picture of a penguin. This ancient practice is still fossilized in modern Chinese. The character radical for shell, bei, is a component in many characters related to money, value, and trade. For all this knowledge, fundamental questions remain. Historians still argue about the nature of land ownership in the Shang. Was all land the king's personal property, which he doled out to his lords in exchange for loyalty and tribute? Or did a system of private, clan-based ownership exist alongside the king's domains? The bones give us tantalizing clues but no definitive legal code. They show us a system that was deeply tied not just to the cycles of the earth and the flow of tribute, but also to the great predictable cycles of the heavens. The Shang economy was governed by the cycles of the earth, but the king's authority was guaranteed by his mastery of the cycles of the heavens. To the Shang, the sky was not a silent, predictable clockwork of stars and planets. It was a vast, divine message board, the ultimate oracle. An unexpected event in the heavens, a sudden darkening of the sun, a new star blazing in the night, was a direct communication from Dai and the ancestors, a portent that had to be read and understood. Your journey through the archives now takes you into the realm of the astronomer-priest, charting the heavens for omens. The most fundamental duty of the king in this regard was the creation and maintenance of the calendar. For an agricultural society like the Shang, a reliable calendar was not a convenience. It was a tool of survival. The king had to know when to plant, when to harvest, and when the seasonal floods might arrive. The Shang employed a sophisticated lunisolar calendar, attempting to reconcile the 29.5-day cycle of the moon with the 365.25-day cycle of the sun. To keep the 12 lunar months aligned with the solar seasons, they periodically had to insert an extra intercalary 13th month. The decision of when to do this was a matter of immense importance, and it was, of course, a subject for divination. You read the bones. The king charges, "In this year, should we add a 13th month?" An accurate calendar was a sign of a well-ordered kingdom in harmony with the cosmos. A king who controlled time was a king who truly possessed the mandate of heaven. But beyond the regular rhythm of the calendar, the Shang were meticulous observers of irregular celestial phenomena, and their records are breathtaking. You find an inscription from the reign of King Wu Ding, dated to the 31st day of the cycle. It reads, The sun was eclipsed in the evening. Is it auspicious? For the Shang, a solar eclipse wasn't a cool event to watch with special glasses. It was a terrifying omen, a sign that the celestial order had been dangerously disrupted. It was the universe sending a very scary all-caps text message directly to the king, usually with a lot of skull emojis. They recorded lunar eclipses too, sometimes with hauntingly poetic descriptions like, "3 flames ate the moon." There are even inscriptions that mention the sudden appearance of a new great star, almost certainly the earliest known records of a nova or supernova. These brief matter-of-fact records are of incalculable scientific value. The oracle bones contain the world's oldest confirmed dated observations of solar eclipses. Because the paths of ancient eclipses can be precisely calculated by modern astronomers, these 3,200-year-old records serve as a crucial anchor point, allowing us to align the Shang calendar and its king list with absolute astronomical certainty. They kept such good records that astronomers today can use them to verify their own complex models of celestial mechanics. It's like getting a fact check from a 3,000-year-old ghost who was really good at astronomy. This meticulous record-keeping has sparked an intense debate. Historians and astronomers still argue about whether the Shang could predict eclipses. Did their long-term observations allow them to recognize patterns and develop a predictive model, however rudimentary? Or were they simply reacting to these events, recording them after the fact and scrambling to interpret their meaning? Prediction would imply a level of mathematical astronomy we have no direct evidence for, but their focus on the sky was so intense that it's hard to rule out entirely. What is certain is that a negative omen from the heavens was a moment of political crisis. It suggested that the king's virtue was lacking, that the ancestors were displeased, that the vital connection between the human world and the divine world was broken. The sky was the ultimate arbiter of royal legitimacy. The authenticity of these records is paramount, which is precisely why, once their value became known in the modern world, they immediately became the target of skilled and deceptive forgers. The immense historical and astronomical value of the bones had an immediate and unfortunate side effect. It created a market. And wherever a market for rare, priceless artifacts appears, a shadow market in clever forgeries is never far behind. Your journey now takes you out of the scholar's library and into the murky, deceptive world of the early 20th century Chinese antiquities trade. You are a collector, desperate to acquire these messengers from the past. But you must navigate a landscape riddled with traps laid by skilled and artful deceivers. As soon as scholars created a demand for ancient bones with weird writing on them, a whole new industry of creating ancient bones with weird writing on them popped up overnight. It's the circle of life for the antiques market. The forgers were often the local farmers and artisans of Anyang themselves. They had a distinct advantage. They were the ones digging up the real bones, so they had a ready supply of raw materials and an intimate familiarity with the genuine article. At first, the fakes were clumsy. A forger would take a random piece of old fossil bone and crudely scratch some characters onto it that looked vaguely like the real thing. To an expert, these were laughable, the equivalent of a tourist trap souvenir. But the forgers were quick learners, and they adapted to the growing sophistication of their clientele. Soon more complex forgeries began to appear. A common trick was to take a small genuine fragment with a few real characters and skillfully embed it into a larger piece of blank ancient bone, making it seem like a much more complete and valuable inscription. But the true artistry lay in creating entirely new forgeries from scratch. The masters of this craft would acquire large uninscribed Shang-era ox scapulae or turtle plastrons, which were plentiful and authentic, and then set to work. Some would meticulously copy an inscription from a published book of rubbings. These were difficult to spot, but a true connoisseur might notice the carver's hand was hesitant, the strokes lacking the fluid, confident power of a Shang scribe. The most brilliant forgeries, however, were entirely new compositions. A master forger, steeped in the published works of oracle bone scholars, would learn the vocabulary, the grammar, and the names of the kings and diviners. They would then write a completely original but plausible divination onto a piece of genuine ancient bone. These were the masterpieces of deception, designed to fool the most learned experts. Some of these forgers were so good, they probably could have gotten a job as a royal scribe in the Shang Dynasty, provided their resume didn't list deception as their primary skill. Telling a real oracle bone from one of these fakes is a nightmare. It's like trying to tell the difference between a real tweet from a celebrity and a really convincing parody account. You need to know their whole history to spot the lie. Detecting these fakes became a high-stakes intellectual game. You, the collector, would have to become an expert in everything from the geology of fossilization to the subtle shifts in scribal practice between the reigns of different kings. You'd examine the patina of the bone, the microscopic marks of the carving tool, and most importantly, the content of the inscription itself. Is the diviner's name correct for the period mentioned in the preface? Is the phrasing of the charge consistent with other divinations on that topic? It was a battle of wits fought across the centuries. A strange and fascinating postscript to this story is that some of these forgeries made by particularly famous craftsmen are now collected and studied in their own right, not as Shang records, but as artifacts of the complex history of the oracle bone's rediscovery. This has sparked a debate in the museum world. Historians and curators still argue whether to display known forgeries. Should they be condemned to storage or exhibited as a vital part of the story? Amid this storm of fakes and genuine articles, a great migration was beginning, as thousands of authentic oracle bones began to leave China, scattering this once unified royal archive across the entire globe. In the chaotic first few decades of the 20th century, as the Shang Dynasty crumbled and China was plunged into turmoil, the Earth of Anyang continued to give up its ancient secrets. But now the buyers were not just Chinese scholars. A new group of collectors appeared on the scene: Western missionaries, diplomats, explorers, and academics, armed with cash and an insatiable curiosity. And so began the great, unplanned diaspora of the Shang royal archives. For 3,000 years, these bones didn't move more than a few feet. Then, in the span of 30 years, they got more stamps in their passports than a jet-setting travel blogger, ending up everywhere from Toronto to Kyoto. You can trace the paths they took. A Canadian Presbyterian missionary named James Mellon Menzies becomes one of the most prolific collectors. He lives in China, learns the language, and develops a scholar's eye for authentic pieces. He painstakingly acquires thousands of fragments, which he eventually ships back to Canada, where they form the magnificent collection of the Royal Ontario Museum. In Britain, a diplomat named Lionel Charles Hopkins uses his connections to amass his own trove, which now resides in the Cambridge University Library, a foundational collection for oracle bone studies in Europe. In America, another missionary, Frank H. Chalfant, sends his acquisitions to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And across the sea in Japan, scholars and collectors already deeply versed in the history of Chinese characters begin building what would become the largest repositories of oracle bones outside of China. Imagine the journey. A turtle plastron, inscribed with King Wu Ding's worries about his wife, is carefully wrapped in silk and paper, placed in a wooden crate in a dusty dealer's shop in Beijing. It travels by cart to the port of Tianjin, is loaded into the hold of a steamship, and spends weeks crossing the Pacific or Indian Ocean, finally being unpacked in the damp, cool air of London or the snowy winter of Toronto. This single unified archive, which had been so carefully curated and then ritually buried by the Shang, was now being scattered to the four corners of the world. This diaspora is a deeply complex legacy. On the one hand, there is a strong argument for preservation. Many of these collections were assembled before the outbreak of the devastating Second Sino-Japanese War and the subsequent Chinese Civil War. It is tragically plausible that if these bones had remained in China, many could have been destroyed or lost in the decades of horrific conflict that followed. Their presence in stable overseas collections ensured their survival. But on the other hand, the archive was broken. Studying the oracle bones today is like trying to read a novel where Chapter 1 is in Beijing, Chapter 2 is in London, and the last page is hiding in a drawer in Pittsburgh. The fragmentation is a tremendous obstacle to research. In the most poignant cases, two halves of a single broken turtle shell ended up in museums on different continents. In recent years, a quiet digital repatriation has begun. Using high-resolution 3D scanning and international databases, scholars can now virtually reunite these long-lost fragments. A piece in Taipei can be digitally stitched back together with its other half in a collection in Edinburgh, the inscription finally made whole again on a computer screen. This work highlights the ongoing and often heated debate about cultural heritage. Historians and governments still argue about the final destination of these scattered records. Should they be returned to China as priceless national treasures, or have they become part of a shared global human heritage, with their current institutions acting as legitimate custodians for the world? The debate over who owns the bones is almost as complicated as the inscriptions themselves. It involves international law, colonial history, and a lot of very polite but very firm letters between museum directors. And as these digital technologies bring the archive back together, other modern scientific techniques are being applied to the bones themselves, revealing secrets that even the script cannot tell. For over a century, the study of oracle bones was the study of a text. It was a discipline of philology and history, requiring a deep knowledge of ancient characters and a scholar's patience. But today, a new chapter is being written. The scattered archive is being re-examined, not just by historians in libraries, but by scientists in sterile laboratories. The focus is shifting from the inscription on the bone to the bone itself. You are now in a clean room, a place of microscopes and mass spectrometers, and you are learning that the physical object is an archive in its own right, with secrets to tell that were never carved into its surface. For 100 years, studying these bones meant you needed good glasses and a knowledge of ancient Chinese. Now you need a PhD in geochemistry and a multi-million-dollar mass spectrometer. The required skill set has expanded. The first step is to see the bone in a new light. Using high-resolution 3D laser scanners, you create a perfect digital replica of an ox scapula, a model you can twist, turn, and magnify on a screen. This non-destructive technique allows you to become a forensic expert on ancient carving. You can zoom into the microscopic grooves of a single character and analyze the tool marks, determining if the scribe used a sharp bronze stylus or a harder jade point. You can measure the precise depth and angle of the cracks, looking for patterns that might reveal the secrets of pyromancy, and you can enhance characters that have been worn smooth over 3,000 years, making the unreadable readable again. But the truly revolutionary science happens when you analyze the very substance of the bone. Using a technique called stable isotope analysis, you can drill a tiny, almost invisible sample of bone powder and learn where the animal it came from spent its life. The ratio of elements like strontium and oxygen in an animal's bones directly reflects the unique geological and water signature of the region where it grazed. Using isotopes to find out where a 3,000-year-old ox grew up is the ultimate cold case investigation. The strontium ratios don't lie, you can imagine the scientist saying. This bull was from the south side of the river. This technique has provided definitive proof for what was long suspected. Many of the turtles used in royal divinations were not local. Their isotopic signatures match those of the middle Yangtze River Valley, hundreds of miles to the south, confirming the existence of a vast tribute network that supplied the capital with these sacred materials. The science gets even more personal with ancient DNA analysis. By carefully extracting the fragile, degraded DNA molecules that can sometimes survive for millennia within the bone's mineral matrix, you can move from geography to genetics. You can identify the exact species of the turtles, trace the lineage of the Shang King's sacrificial cattle, and reconstruct the biodiversity of their livestock. You can even look for the genetic markers of ancient diseases, adding a new chapter to the history of epidemiology. This new science, however, comes with a profound ethical dilemma. Techniques like isotope and DNA analysis are destructive. They require the removal of a small amount of the original material, a permanent alteration of a priceless artifact. This has ignited a fierce debate within the museum and academic communities. To what extent should we allow this destructive sampling? Curators, whose primary duty is to preserve these objects for posterity, must weigh that responsibility against the scientists' quest for groundbreaking new data. It's the academic equivalent of asking, should we perform an autopsy on a ghost? You might learn something amazing, but you're also disturbing the spirit of the artifact. It's a debate that forces us to constantly redefine our relationship with these objects, seeing them not just as historical texts, but as complex artifacts that sit at the very intersection of the humanities and the hard sciences, still fueling new questions and new arguments. You have gathered all the evidence. You've read the king's mind, cataloged his wealth, mapped his cosmos, and analyzed the very bones he used to speak to his ancestors. Now you must confront the ultimate question, the central mystery that all of this data points toward. Who really was the Shang King? What was the fundamental nature of his power? Was he a mystic, a clergyman, or a politician? It is a question that has fueled one of the most enduring debates in the study of ancient China. Historians still argue about the fundamental source of the Shang King's authority, with three main models competing for dominance. Was he primarily a shaman, a chief priest, or a master bureaucrat? The first model imagines the king as the chief shaman. In this view, his power was not inherited like a crown, but earned through his unique personal ability to traverse the spiritual barrier. You picture the king in a trance, his consciousness traveling to the spirit world, perhaps aided by the potent vapors of ritual wines and the hypnotic animal faces staring out from the bronze vessels. The divination ritual in this light is not a formal procedure but a moment of ecstatic, shamanic communion. The king is the ultimate medium, the only one who can truly speak with the dead. The shaman king theory paints the king as this mystical figure, going into trances to chat with ghosts. It's a cool image, but as you look at the sheer volume of bones, it's hard to imagine him having time for that between all the wars and the paperwork. This leads to the second model, the king as chief priest. This interpretation sees the Shang court as less of a shaman's hut and more of a state church. The king's authority comes not from personal ecstatic experience, but from his inherited position as the head of the royal lineage. He is the pope of the ancestor cult. His power lies in his ability to perform the established rituals correctly, to say the right words and offer the right sacrifices at the right time. The diviners are his ordained clergy, and the oracle bones are the liturgy of a highly organized institutional religion. The chief priest model makes the king sound a bit like a Bronze Age pope, with a really nice hat and a direct line to the ancestors. The main difference is that his communion wafers were made of sacrificed oxen. This view better explains the formulaic, repetitive nature of the thousands of inscriptions. The third model is the most modern and, in many ways, the most radical. It proposes that the king was, first and foremost, the head bureaucrat. This theory doesn't deny the religious beliefs of the Shang, but it sees them as the medium, not the message, of power. The king was a rational administrator running a complex state. The divination system was his administrative technology. It was a tool for decision-making, a way to generate consensus among the elite, and, most critically, a method for creating a permanent, centralized record of government affairs. The ritual was a means to a political end. This is the king as CEO, using the world's most elaborate form of meeting minutes to run his kingdom. Let the records show the ancestors have approved the Q3 budget, he might as well be saying. The meticulous archiving, the verifications, the sheer data-driven nature of the process all support this view. So which was he? The shaman, the priest, or the bureaucrat? The truth, as is so often the case, is likely a complex fusion of all three. He was a bureaucratic king of a state church that was founded on shamanic principles. His power was a tapestry woven from lineage, ritual performance, and administrative control. He was the indispensable center of a system where politics and religion were not just intertwined, but were one and the same thing. This unique and powerful synthesis defined the Shang state at its zenith, but it was a system that would not last. As the centuries wore on, the power of the Shang kings began to wane, and the fires of the divination ritual began to grow cold. You have walked with kings and diviners, witnessed their rituals, and felt their anxieties. You have seen the Shang Dynasty at its glorious, terrifying zenith under Wu Ding. But no dynasty lasts forever. Your journey now takes you to the final, twilight years of the Shang. You watch as the fires of the divination ritual, which once burned so brightly, begin to flicker and fade, and a new power rises in the West, bringing with it a new god and a new theory of power. The oracles, which for centuries had been the vibrant, beating heart of the kingdom, are about to fall silent. The evidence for the decline is right there in the bones themselves. As you examine the inscriptions from the reigns of the final Shang kings, you notice a subtle but profound change. The frantic, wide-ranging anxiety of Wu Ding's era is gone. In its place is a rigid, sterile formalism. The questions become more routine, the scope narrows, and the prognostication becomes almost universally positive. The king will ask, "Will there be disaster in the coming week?" And then, often before the crack is even interpreted, the inscription will record the king's own judgment. Grandly auspicious. The system is becoming a rubber stamp. It's like asking your mom if you are handsome. You already know the answer you're going to get. The dynamic conversation with the spirit world has devolved into a hollow piece of political theater. A king talking to himself. While this internal rot was setting in, the rival Zhou people on the western frontier were growing stronger. Led by a series of shrewd and capable rulers, they transformed from a vassal state into a major threat. And they brought with them a revolutionary new idea, the mandate of heaven, or Tianming. They worshipped a supreme sky god, Tian, and they argued that heaven grants the right to rule only to a just and virtuous sovereign. If a king becomes corrupt, cruel, and inept, heaven will signal its displeasure through natural disasters and will withdraw the mandate, bestowing it upon a new, more worthy dynasty. The mandate of heaven was the ultimate cosmic pink slip. If your kingdom had a bad quarter, with a few too many floods or famines, heaven could just say, "Sorry, Your Majesty, we're going in a different direction," and hire the Zhou to replace you. This potent ideology gave the Zhou the moral justification for rebellion. Around 1046 BCE, the final confrontation came at the Battle of Muye. King Wu of Zhou marched his army against the last Shang king, Dixin. The traditional histories written by the victorious Zhou paint Dixin as a monster of depravity, and they claim that his own troops, disgusted by his rule, turned against him on the battlefield. The Shang Dynasty, which had lasted for over 500 years, collapsed in a single day. With the fall of the House of Shang, the great tradition of oracle bone pyromancy withered and died. The Zhou kings had no need to consult the Shang ancestors. Indeed, to do so would be to acknowledge the spiritual authority of the dynasty they had just violently overthrown. The Zhou didn't just conquer the Shang, they changed the management of the entire universe. They basically told the Shang ancestors, "Thank you for your service, your consultation contract has expired." While the Zhou did practice their own forms of divination, the grand, industrial-scale ritual of cracking turtle shells and ox scapulae, with its massive archives, came to an end. The practice that had defined the Bronze Age vanished from history. The bones fell silent. The pits at Yinshu were buried, the palaces crumbled, and the city was abandoned to the encroaching farmland. The memory of this writing, this archive, this entire world, was swallowed by the earth, destined to lie forgotten for 3,000 years. But the script itself, the elegant characters carved into those bones, did not die. It simply began a new journey. The oracle bones fell silent and their civilization turned to dust, buried and forgotten for 3 millennia. But the most vital part of them, the elegant and complex script carved into their surfaces, did not die. It escaped the tomb. It survived the fall of the dynasty and began a new and extraordinary journey, an unbroken evolutionary line that connects the smoky temples of the Shang directly to the glowing screens of the 21st century. What you have been reading is not a dead language. It is the earliest known version of a living one. After the Zhou conquest, the script migrated from bone to bronze. It was cast into the magnificent ritual vessels of the new dynasty, becoming more rounded, more regular, but still recognizably the same writing. Centuries later, the first emperor of a unified China, Qin Shi Huang, famously standardized the script, creating a universal seal script that was the direct government-mandated descendant of the Shang characters. From there it continued to evolve, morphing into the clerical script of the Han Dynasty, and finally settling into the standard script, or Kaishu, that has been the norm for the last 1,500 years. This is the crucial difference between the Chinese script and other ancient writing systems like cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs. Those systems died out. Their meaning was lost, and they had to be laboriously deciphered from scratch with the help of a key, like the Rosetta Stone. The Chinese script never died. It adapted, it changed its clothes, but it never once broke the chain of transmission. The ghost of the Shang scribe is still alive in every Chinese newspaper, every book, every sign on every street. The DNA is unmistakable. You look at the modern character for a mountain, Shan. It is still the 3 peaks you saw carved on the ox scapula. The character for tree, Mu, is still a representation of branches and roots. The character for rest, Shu, is even today a pictograph of a person, Ren, leaning against a tree, Mu. The fundamental logic, the pictographic soul of the writing system, has survived for over 3,000 years. The principles of combining radicals for meaning and sound, perfected by the Shang, remain the cornerstone of the language. The art of calligraphy, so central to East Asian aesthetics, is the direct inheritor of the Shang scribe's craft, a continuation of the same pursuit of balance, line, and form. So the next time you see a Chinese character, remember you're not just looking at a word. You're looking at a 3,000-year-old ghost, a tiny fossil of a thought that began as a scratch on a bone. This ancient script, born from the union of fire and bone in a mysterious ritual, is now at the center of a new debate. Linguists and computer scientists argue about its future in the digital age. Is a system with thousands of characters inherently clumsy compared to a simple alphabet? Or does its incredible information density and deep cultural resonance give it a unique and enduring power? The journey you have taken, from a dusty apothecary in 1899 back to the heart of the Bronze Age, ends here, with this living legacy. The forgotten archives were found, and in reading them, you found not a lost world, but the very roots of a modern one. And so our journey comes to a close. The fires in the Shang temple have long since gone out, and the voices of the diviners have faded into the silence of 30 centuries. The questions that seemed so urgent, the outcome of a battle, the ache of a tooth, the coming of the rain, have all been answered by the simple, inexorable passage of time. The great archive, once so meticulously curated and then so utterly forgotten, now rests quietly in museums and libraries around the world, its work now done. You can let the images fade now. The glowing tip of the bronze poker, the sharp crack of the turtle shell, the glint of a scribe's stylus in the flickering torchlight. All of that anxiety, all of that power and ritual, has resolved itself into a deep and profound stillness. There are no more questions to be asked of the bones tonight, and no more sacrifices that need to be made. The ancestors are quiet and content. The great river flows peacefully under the moon, and the fields of millet are safe from harm. You can feel the great weight of that ancient world lifting, leaving behind only a quiet sense of wonder and the gentle hum of the fan in your own quiet room. It is time to let the past rest, to let it all go, and to allow your own mind to drift into the soft, quiet darkness. There is nothing left to do now but sleep.